Hello, everyone. Today we are going to explore a chilling but also intriguing story that took place in Ontario, Canada. This region is not only famous for its magnificent natural landscapes, such as Niagara Falls or vast green forests, but also hides terrifying secrets. In the peaceful surroundings of Caledon, a suburb just about an hour's drive from downtown Toronto, a shocking murder occurred that left the entire nation in awe. This story is not only a wake-up call about the dangers that may lurk in the safest places, but also a testament to the determination of the investigators in solving the case. Let's step into the Susan family case and uncover the truth. On April 13, 1992, which was a Monday, the Susan family held their annual maple syrup party. Every year, Susan invited her friends and family to her farm in Caledon to join the celebration and enjoy her homemade, delicious maple syrup. The farm in Caledon was an inheritance left by Susan's father. His estate spanned from downtown Toronto to Caledon. Susan and her brother Ian inherited it together. Each of them owned a house in Toronto and a farm in Caledon. Susan and Ian grew up very close, and later each of them started their own families. Susan lived with her husband, Orville, and they had a son named Jamie. Jamie had become independent and lived in Toronto, but still kept in close contact with his parents and his Uncle Ian's family. Ian lived with his wife Nancy, and they had no children, but they had a small cat. On normal days, Susan and Ian both lived in downtown Toronto. During vacations, they often visited the farm in Caledon. Whether in Toronto or Caledon, Susan and Ian's homes were not far apart. The siblings frequently visited each other and had keys to each other's houses. On the day of the maple syrup party at the Caledon farm, Susan woke up early to prepare. As time passed and night fell, around 40 to 50 guests invited by Susan gradually arrived at the farm. However, what was strange was that Ian, Susan's brother, and his wife Nancy had still not appeared. In fact, Susan had not seen Ian for a few days and could not get in touch with him. A few days earlier, Susan and her husband Orville had discovered Ian's car parked next to his cabin at the farm. They thought Ian had come from Toronto to the farm. But after 2 to 3 days, Susan and Orville still hadn't seen Ian. So they decided to use their spare keys to open Ian's cabin. On the bed in the bedroom on the first floor, there were 2 neatly placed bags containing Ian and Nancy's clothes. It appeared that they had prepared their clothes for the party. Ian was not in the cabin, but everything in the house seemed normal. Susan and her husband thought that Ian and his wife might have gone somewhere. What Susan didn't expect was that even on the day of the party, Ian and his wife still hadn't shown up. Normally, Ian was a man of his word. If he couldn't attend, he would definitely let them know. This made Susan worried. She picked up the phone to call Ian but couldn't get through. She then reached out to Ian's friends, but no one knew where he had gone. Nancy, Ian's wife, had lupus, a chronic disease that recurs in episodes. When the disease flares up, red butterfly-shaped rashes appear on her face. This disease cannot be cured completely. During winter, patients need to keep warm and avoid exposure to cold air. Therefore, Nancy would not usually visit the farm in Caledon during cold weather. Although it was April and spring had arrived, the temperature in Caledon had not yet risen. Normally, Nancy wouldn't visit the farm during this time. But every year for the maple syrup party, no matter how cold the weather, Nancy would make sure to attend. This time, however, was clearly an exception. Susan really couldn't think of a reason why they both suddenly failed to show up at the maple syrup party without any prior notice. Thinking they might still be in Toronto, Susan called her son, Jamie, who lived there, and asked him to bring the spare keys to Ian's house to check if they were home. Jamie followed his mother's instructions, bringing the keys to Ian's house in Toronto. When he arrived, Jamie saw that the front door was locked, and the lights inside were off. Nancy's Chevrolet car was still parked outside, and everything seemed fine. However, Jamie quickly noticed that the mailbox outside was full of letters and newspapers. It seemed that no one had collected them for several days. As Jamie entered the house, he found Nancy's handbag on the bed in the bedroom, the top open. After checking the whole room, Jamie called his parents to report the situation. After hearing this, Susan and Orville felt that something was wrong because Nancy was a very careful person. She would never leave her handbag in such a visible place, especially with the top open. Ian and Nancy also had a small cat. Whenever they went away, they would always take the cat with them. So Susan and Orville asked Jamie to go back to Ian's house again to check if the cat was there. If it was, it would mean Ian and his wife had not gone far. Jamie carefully checked every room in the house and finally found the cat in the basement. But it seemed like it hadn't been cared for in a while. The food dish was empty, with no food or water. The cat meowed incessantly when it saw Jamie. Clearly, it had been left unfed for many days. At that moment, Jamie had a bad feeling. After feeding the cat, Jamie continued searching the house. Eventually, he found Nancy's spare car key. Jamie decided to check Nancy's Chevrolet to see if he could find any clues. He went to the car, opened it, and checked inside. A handful of napkins on the driver's seat caught his attention. There were red stains on them. Also, a foul odor occasionally emanated from the car. Jamie's bad feeling grew stronger. He went to the back of the car, opened the trunk, and the scene in front of him was one he would never forget. Ian and Nancy were lying in the trunk. There were no signs of life, and their bodies were cold. Jamie realized something was terribly wrong. He immediately called the police. Then he called his parents in Caledon to inform them. Upon receiving the call, the Toronto police mobilized forces to the scene. After securing the area, the examination began. In the trunk were the bodies of the homeowners, Ian and his wife. Ian was lying on the outside, Nancy on the inside. Unlike Nancy, who wasn't dressed, Ian was fully dressed. The autopsy revealed multiple bruises and abrasions on Nancy's body. Signs indicated that she had been tied up at her wrists, ankles, and neck. There were deep bruises on her shoulder. The initial speculation was that before she died, her hands and feet were bound, and her mouth was gagged. Ian had a mark on his neck from being strangled. There were also marks on his right wrist, thighs, and knees from being tied. His right cheek was bruised. Both victims died from asphyxiation. The time of death was determined to be more than 5 days ago. There were no clothes of Nancy in the car. Ian was fully dressed. Ian's wallet was found in his pants pocket. It contained his ID and credit cards, but no cash. The house was neat and showed no signs of forced entry or a struggle. On the bed in the bedroom was an open handbag. The credit cards inside the bag were still intact. The police speculated that perhaps a small amount of cash had been taken, but it was not much. Aside from that, the police found nothing unusual at the scene. They decided to start the investigation by looking into the victims' movements and relationships before their deaths. Ian, 55 years old, worked in real estate, a high-pressure job. 6 days before the murder, on April 7th, Ian decided to drive to the cabin at his Caledon farm to relax for a day. He had informed his colleagues about his plans. But after that day, no one saw Ian again. Although no one saw Ian at the farm, Susan, Orville, the locals in Caledon, and the patrolling police all saw Ian's Cadillac parked outside the cabin. Everyone believed Ian had been to the cabin. Ian's wife, Nancy, 49 years old, was a nurse. She usually worked at schools in Toronto and also volunteered at homeless shelters. Nancy knew about her husband's plan to go to the cabin to relax for the day. However, Ian said he would return home to Toronto in the evening. That evening, Nancy returned home, but Ian hadn't come back. Later, Nancy mentioned this to her friends and expressed her concern. On that evening at 7:36 p.m., a call was made from the Caledon Farms cabin to Nancy's house in Toronto. The call lasted 3 minutes. After that day, neither Nancy nor Ian went to work. Their colleagues and friends didn't know where they had gone and couldn't contact them. The police confirmed that the last time anyone saw Ian and Nancy was on April 7th, 6 days before the murder. The police went to Ian's cabin at the Caledon farm for inspection. The cabin had a simple wooden door, locked with a padlock. There was no sign of forced entry at the front door. However, the bedroom window showed signs of being pried open. The suspect may have entered the cabin through the window. Inside the cabin, it was very tidy. There were a few empty beer cans in the kitchen, but no signs of a struggle. The police found some blood on the stairs leading to the second floor. Blood samples were sent to the Toronto Forensic Science Center for testing. It was confirmed that the blood belonged to Nancy, which meant that Nancy had likely been murdered inside the cabin. However, the police couldn't find any further clues in the cabin near the farm. The investigators discovered a unique octagonal granary. The granary, built in 1894, had a very distinctive architecture. At the end of the 19th century, this type of octagonal granary was very popular in Ontario. But the octagonal granary near Ian's farm was the only one left in Caledon and still retained its unique local style. The planks used were vertical, with an additional roof overhang on the side. The octagonal granary was originally used to store grain and became widespread due to its practicality in agriculture. It also had some religious significance. It was believed that the octagonal granary didn't have dark, deep corners where demons could hide. Today, the octagonal granary is no longer used to store grain, but it still has a very spacious interior, making it an ideal place to hide things. Therefore, the police also conducted a thorough search of the octagonal granary, but didn't find anything unusual. So why did this couple die so mysteriously? There was a theory suggesting that Nancy had been having an affair. Her lover, upon learning that Ian was coming to the cabin at the farm, had pried open the window to break into the house with the intent to kill Ian. But unexpectedly, he encountered Nancy, who had come looking for her husband, and in a panic, he killed her. However, after an investigation, the police found that Ian and Nancy had been married for nearly 25 years and had a very good relationship. They were considered a faithful, loving couple. Upon checking Nancy's phone records, the police didn't find any signs of an affair. There were almost no clues left by the killer at the scene. The case became a deadlock after a week of investigation without any progress. The police couldn't find a suspect with a clear motive. They decided to invite a criminal psychological analyst to assist with the investigation. The criminal psychological analyst is a trained professional. They can profile the criminal by analyzing the crime scene, the victim, and the method of the crime, including the suspect's gender, age, occupation, personality, preferences, etc., thereby helping the police narrow down the scope of the investigation and solve the case. Criminal psychology emerged in the 1970s, but wasn't widely used in criminal investigations at that time. Some people believed these analysts were just blabbering fools, and their analyses were not considered evidence in court. However, the local police decided to invite criminal psychological analyst Kate Lines to participate in the investigation. She had been trained at the FBI Academy. This was one of the first cases that Kate directly participated in as a criminal psychological analyst. Kate went to the cabin at the Caledon farm, and after a thorough inspection, she didn't find anything unusual. The cabin was very tidy, with no signs of a struggle. Kate thought that the murderer must have subdued Ian in a short amount of time. Next, Kate checked Nancy's Chevrolet. The bodies of Nancy and Ian were found in the trunk of this car. Kate noticed that the driver's seat was adjusted quite far back from the steering wheel. This suggested that the person who last drove Nancy's car was someone taller than her. However, Nancy was of small stature, so someone else must have driven her car and adjusted the seat. Kate then analyzed the condition of the two victims and the method of the crime. Both Nancy and Ian had marks from being tied up, but the locations of the marks on their bodies were not the same. Nancy's hands and feet were tied, while the marks on Ian were mainly on his right wrist and thighs. Kate believed that the marks on Nancy were deeper, indicating that the killer had used a lot of force to tie her up while she was still alive. Considering Nancy's condition and injuries, the way the killer treated Nancy was different from how he treated Ian. He was more brutal and ruthless with Nancy. Based on the injuries to both victims, it seemed clear that Nancy had suffered more pain while alive. It was evident that the killer harbored intense anger toward Nancy. Kate theorized that Nancy was the primary target of the killer, who was male, and that the motive for the crime might have been sexual. Additionally, Kate provided several other details about the killer. Offenders who engage in personal violence usually have similar ages to their victims. However, in this case, the killer had the ability to subdue both victims and transport the bodies into the trunk by himself. Kate speculated that the killer was a healthy young man, aged between 35 and 45 years. Ian had good relationships with everyone and had no enemies. Kate believed that the killer wasn't someone Ian knew, but rather a stranger, since the killer had almost left no traces at the scene, and the cabin was so tidy. It seemed like this was a premeditated crime, and the killer had likely been in the Caledon area for some time, familiar with the farm and the family. Kate speculated that the killer was unemployed, had no close family, and therefore posed a high risk of reoffending. Based on her previous research on similar cases, Kate believed that the killer was someone who was socially isolated, eccentric, and introverted. However, when necessary, he could still communicate normally. The killer's appearance was unkempt, with slovenly clothing and poor personal hygiene. He may have had a history of minor crimes. Kate speculated that on the day of the murder, Ian drove to the cabin at Caledon, but unexpectedly encountered a man who had broken into the house. The man used a weapon to subdue Ian. Under duress, Ian called his wife in Toronto from the cabin, telling her he had changed his mind and wouldn't return to Toronto that evening, but would stay at the cabin overnight. The killer then forced Ian to make up an excuse for Nancy to drive to the cabin so they could both be there. After receiving the call, Nancy drove her Chevrolet to the Caledon farm, but unexpectedly encountered the man as soon as she arrived. The man then restrained and killed Nancy in the cabin, then hid her body in the trunk. It's unclear why the killer forced Ian to drive Nancy's Chevrolet back to Toronto. Afterward, he killed Ian and hid his body in the trunk as well. Kate believed the killer was very dangerous, and he was likely obsessed with torture. Such criminals tend to humiliate and abuse their victims, causing them physical and psychological pain. The killer was highly likely to reoffend. The next victims may face the same tragic fate as Ian and Nancy. With the support of the criminal psychological analyst, the police made an important discovery. A garbage bag was found in a ditch about 100 meters from Ian's farm cabin. Inside the bag was an empty beer can, matching the type of cans found in the cabin, along with some torn newspaper pieces. The date on the newspaper was 4 months before the murder. There was also a bag of feces and a few handwritten notes. Some words were crossed out and the contents seemed to refer to weapons, tanks, and warships, resembling a list of military equipment. Before Ian and Nancy were killed, local media had been reporting a series of break-ins. Due to the cold weather, many people in Caledon had moved to the city, leaving many houses unoccupied. A thief, nicknamed the Hermit Thief, had taken advantage of the vacant houses to steal valuables, including jewelry, clothes, and even other personal items. However, the thief was never caught and left no traces, making it mysterious. The locals called him the Hermit Thief. This thief had a unique trait. He often left behind adult magazines, paper bags, or bags of feces in the houses he broke into. He also left many handwritten lists of military equipment. The items found in the ditch near Ian's cabin were exactly like those left by the hermit thief in previous burglaries, including the handwritten military equipment list. The police believed that the murderer of Ian and Nancy was the same hermit thief who had been terrorizing the town. However, this thief was not always perfect in his actions. Due to the media attention, many people in Caledon worried that their homes might be broken into, so they occasionally came back to check on their properties. On one occasion, as the hermit thief was preparing to break into a house, the homeowner unexpectedly returned. The thief quickly reacted, used a weapon to subdue the homeowner, and demanded to be driven to Toronto. On the way, the thief told the homeowner that he was wanted for fraud. He knew that wealthy people, like the homeowner, likely had houses in both Caledon and Toronto. The thief demanded to be taken to the Toronto house to lay low. The homeowner refused. When they reached a busy intersection in downtown Toronto, the homeowner suddenly stopped the car and told the thief to get out. The thief had no choice but to run away. Although the police didn't know the thief's whereabouts after he got out of the car, they managed to collect fingerprints from the thief at the crime scene. However, since the thief had no criminal record, no matches were found in the database. Suspicion about the hermit thief being involved in the deaths of Ian and Nancy grew significantly. The police checked his records and found that his description closely matched the psychological profile provided by Kate. This raised the police's suspicions about the hermit thief even further. The police now saw the handwritten military equipment lists as crucial to identifying the thief's identity. They decided to release the photos of these lists to the public in the hope that someone could provide information. Soon after, they received a tip from a woman named Allison. She stated that she knew the identity of the hermit thief. His name was David Snow. David Snow, 37 years old, was revealed to be the thief. When David was born, his parents had hoped for a daughter. They were disappointed to have a son. When David was over 3 years old, his family moved to Orangeville. 2 years later, David's younger sister was born. However, David's mother suffered from postpartum depression and directed all her love towards the youngest daughter. When David was 13, his father died from illness, and his mother became even more depressed. From that point on, David began acting out at home. He often insulted and even beat his mother and sister. David couldn't communicate normally with others, and he became addicted to watching pornography. Later, he opened an antique store in town, but it went bankrupt and closed in the year of the murder. Allison, the woman who gave the tip, told the police that after reading a newspaper, she noticed an article titled, "Police Searching for Military Equipment Enthusiast." When she saw the photos published in the newspaper, Allison was shocked to recognize the person who wrote those words. She confirmed that it was David. The tip provided by Allison was crucial to the police investigation. They immediately began investigating David Snow. The results showed that David was wanted for fraud and had been a fugitive in Orangeville. The police compared David's fingerprints with those found at the cabin and confirmed they matched. David was the hermit thief terrorizing the town. Since David was suspected of being involved in the murders of Ian and Nancy, the police went to his house in Orangeville for a search. This time, they found an important piece of evidence connecting David to the murder of Ian and Nancy. At David's house, they found many items related to pornography. More importantly, they discovered a black leather bag containing dozens of photos of the octagonal granary. Today, there are not many intact octagonal granaries left in Ontario, and the one near Ian's farm retains its unique local style. This made the police almost certain that the structure in the photos was the octagonal granary near Ian's farm. Allison mentioned that David had once shown her and her husband pictures of the octagonal granary. David seemed very fond of the place. He knew there was a farm near the granary. The police believed David had been to the octagonal granary several times and was familiar with the area. During that time, he had gathered information about the Ian family and conceived a malicious plan against Nancy. The police launched a massive manhunt across Ontario. All police forces pursued David for over a month, but couldn't find him. Just when the search seemed to hit a dead end, the case took a turn. One day, the Ontario police saw a news report on TV. The North Vancouver police in British Columbia were looking for a suspect. A police officer patrolling the Seymour Mountain area heard strange noises in the forest. When he checked, he found a man tying two women to trees. When the suspect saw the police, he immediately fled. The two women were rescued and reported that they had been brought to the area from their workplace. Afterward, the man had beaten them several times. The man had forced one of them to drive him to the mountains and then tied them to trees. If the police hadn't arrived, they might have been killed. The North Vancouver police were working hard to track down the suspect. They found some of his belongings in the victim's car, which became an important clue. From the news report, the Ontario police realized that the items left behind by the suspect were identical to the ones the hermit thief had stolen. The way the two victims had been tied resembled how Nancy had been restrained. They believed the man being sought by North Vancouver police was the same hermit thief, David Snow. The Ontario police then checked major transportation routes to track down David. Finally, a ticket clerk at the Toronto train station recognized David from the photos. The clerk mentioned that David had been in a hurry, wanted to buy the ticket as quickly as possible, and had been rude. When purchasing the ticket, David had used the fake name David Wilson instead of his real name, David Snow. With the clerk's testimony, the Ontario police were almost certain that David had fled to British Columbia and that the man being sought in North Vancouver was David. Just as criminal psychological analyst Kate had described, David didn't stop on his path of crime. The police were truly racing against time. They needed to capture him before he struck again. On July 12th, 3 months after the murders at 4 a.m., the North Vancouver police received an emergency call from a local restaurant. A man had attacked a 53-year-old female employee at the restaurant, strangling her with a rope. The restaurant's security guard discovered the incident in time and prevented further harm. Luckily, the female employee wasn't seriously injured. The police arrived at the scene and found a man acting panicked and trying to flee. To their surprise, the man was the hermit thief, David Snow. He was immediately arrested. It was notable that criminal psychological analyst Kate had accurately described 25 characteristics of the killer, with 23 of them matching David, especially his age and the motive for the crime. Her analysis had been remarkably accurate. In the cases David had committed in North Vancouver, the victims had all been treated brutally, revealing his sadistic tendencies. 5 years after the murders, the trial for David Snow's involvement in Ian and Nancy's deaths took place at the Toronto court. After deliberation, the court declared David Snow guilty of murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole. David was also convicted of 22 other charges, including robbery, kidnapping, unlawful detention, and sexual assault. In 2008, 11 years after his conviction, David attacked another inmate in prison, threatening to kill him. He was convicted again. A year later, the Canadian Correctional Service determined that David was in extreme danger to society if released. Before being considered for transfer to a lower security facility, David must prove his rehabilitation. After the murder of Ian and Nancy, David was given a new moniker, a serial killer. Now 68 years old, David will continue to pay for his crimes behind bars for the rest of his life. And so, the shocking murder of Ian and Nancy came to a close with a harsh sentence for the killer, David Snow. The crimes he committed not only took the lives of 2 innocent people, but also left an enduring pain for their family. But through this story, we see the progress in the application of criminal psychological analysis, a powerful tool that helped solve the case. The story may be over, but the lessons remain. Always stay vigilant and protect yourself and your loved ones from unexpected dangers. If you found this story interesting or useful, don't forget to share it to spread the message to more people. And if you'd like to hear more intriguing cases, be sure to follow so you don't miss out on any stories. See you in the next story.